Andersonville Prison, also known as Camp Sumter, was a Confederate prisoner of war camp that was used for 14 months between 1864 to 1865. The site lies on the east side of the town Andersonville. The prison was created in February 1864. The prison's commander was Henry Wers, born as Hartman Heinrich Wars, on November 25, 1823. When the prison was first built, it was 16.5 acres. It was surrounded by a 15-foot tall stockade. The stockade was 1,620 feet by 779 feet. The stockade had both a northern and southern entrance. Robert H. Kellogg, Sergeant Major in the 16th Regiment Connecticut Volunteers, he described when he entered the prison in May 2, 1864. It reads,
"As we entered the place, a spectacle met our eyes that almost froze our blood with horror and made our hearts fail within us. Before us were forms that had once been active and erect, stalwart men, now nothing but mere walking skeletons covered with filth and vermin. Many of our men, in the heat and intensity of their feeling, exclaimed with earnestness, 'Can this be hell? God protect us!' And all thought that he alone could bring them out alive from so terrible a place. In the center of the whole was a swamp, occupying about 3 or 4 acres of the narrowed limits, and a part of this marshy place had been used by the prisoners as a sink, and excrement covered the ground, the scent arising from which was suffocating. The ground allotted to our 90 was near the edge of this plague spot, and how we were to live through the warm summer weather in the midst of such fearful surroundings was more than we cared to think of just then."
Andersonville had a smaller fence surrounding the inside. This was known as the dead line. It was around 19 feet from the stockade wall. No prisoner was allowed near this wall. It was made out of logs and was roughly 16 feet tall. If a prisoner touched or even got near the dead line, they would be shot from the guards in the sentry towers on top of the stockade without warning. In 1864, 3 years after the Civil War started, the Confederate Army and Confederate civilians were suffering greatly from food shortages, and this affected the prisoners way worse. The food shortages were suffered by prisoners and prison guards, but the prisoners received much less than the prison guards. The prisoners became severely emaciated due to lack of vitamin C. They did not get fresh fruits or vegetables. They suffered from scurvy because of this. The prison guards did not suffer like the prisoners did. They were hungry, but they weren't completely starving to death like they were. The prisoners' living conditions were atrocious. Extreme filth with poor sanitation. They suffered from dysentery and typhoid fever. The prisoners lived and slept in tents and in the open air. The source of fresh drinking water for the prisoners was a stream that ran through the center of the stockade, and it ran the length of the prison. This also served as a latrine for the men. If the men weren't already sick after drinking the tainted water, they became severely ill. Henry Wers came up with an idea to clear the filth from the stream. He planned to build 2 dams across the stream running through the camp and open them to flush out the bottom of the stream daily, but this was never completed. Charles Chesterman of the 13th U.S. Infantry wrote this about the stream. "All the filth from the prison ran into the creek, and we had to strain the water through our teeth to keep the maggots out." The prisoners did not receive new clothes. They wore what they had. If they arrived dressed in their summer clothes, they were freezing during the winter. There are many stories of clothing being stolen off of the dead or nearly dead. Prisoner John McElroy described this scene. "Before one was fairly cold, his clothes would be appropriated and divided, and I have seen many sharp fights between contesting claimants." The prison was surrounded by woods, but the prisoners were allowed very little wood for cooking and for warmth. The firewood detail quickly disbanded after prisoners seized the opportunity to escape. John Ransom wrote in his diary on May 8, 1864, "We get 1/4 of a loaf of bread weighing about 6 ounces and 4 or 5 ounces of pork." The summer of 1864 was extremely difficult because of the excessive heat, hunger, and disease. The death rate was over 100 prisoners per day. Within 7 months, about 1/3 of the prisoners died from dysentery or scurvy and were buried in mass graves. John Ransom wrote many accounts in his diary about the conditions at Andersonville.
There is so much filth about the camp that it is terrible trying to live here. With sunken eyes, blackened countenances from pitch pine smoke, rags, and disease, the men look sickening. The air reeks with nastiness. Still another recalled, "Since the day I was born, I never saw such misery."
Sergeant Samuel Corthell wrote about his time in the prison.
The camp was covered with vermin all over. You could not sit down anywhere. You might go and pick the lice all off of you and sit down for a half a moment and get up and you would be covered with them. In between these two hills it was very swampy, all black mud, and where the filth was emptied, it was all alive. There was a regular buzz there all the time, and it was covered with large white maggots.
In 1864, the Confederate Surgeon General asked Joseph Jones, an infectious disease expert, to go to the prison and investigate the high mortality rate. He concluded that it was due to sorbutic dysentery caused by vitamin C deficiency. The survival rate was much better if you came in with a group of prisoners, especially if you were from the same unit or from the same hometown. You had an even greater chance of survival. In the short time that the prison was in operation, it received 45,000 prisoners. Out of those, nearly 13,000 died, a 28% mortality rate, mainly due to scurvy, diarrhea, and dysentery. But some simply starved to death because of the meager rations. Father Peter Whelan arrived at Andersonville on June 16, 1864. He would use the Catholic Church to help provide relief for the prisoners. Father Whelan was an Irish-born Catholic priest who served as a chaplain for both Confederate and Union prisoners during the Civil War. Prison population by date: April 1st, 1864, 7,163. May 5th, 12,002. June 13th, 20,654. June 19th, 23,944. July 18th, 29,078. July 31st, 31,680. August 31st, 31,695. It had the highest mortality rate of any prison, north or south, in the entire nation. William Tecumseh Sherman's march to the sea forced many of the prisoners to be moved to Camp Lawton, which was near Millen, Georgia, and the Florence Stockade in Florence, South Carolina. When William Tecumseh Sherman destroyed Millen, the remaining prisoners were moved back to Andersonville. The Union Army finally marched into Andersonville in May 1865. The prisoners inside were described as walking skeletons amid a hellish scene of desolation. Captain Henry Wirz, the stockade commander, was arrested and charged with murder in violation of the laws of war. The trial was presided over by Union General Lew Wallace and featured Judge Advocate General Prosecutor Norton Parker Chipman. Many former inmates testified about the horrible conditions at Andersonville in his trial, and a number of them accused Wirz specifically as committing acts of cruelty. The court considered official correspondences from captured Confederate records. The most damaging was a letter to the Confederate Surgeon General by Joseph Jones, who in 1864 was sent by Richmond to investigate the conditions at Andersonville. Jones was horrified about what he found. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. On November 10, 1865, he was hanged. Captain Wirz was one of 3 men executed after the Civil War for war crimes. He was the only Confederate official. The others were guerrillas: Champ Ferguson and Henry McGrawder. James Duncan, who was the quartermaster at Andersonville, was convicted of manslaughter for allegedly withholding food from some of the prisoners. He had been called as a defense witness for Wirz, but was arrested when he arrived and gave evidence. There were many pictures taken of the prisoners at Richmond and Andersonville in such a horrible state. Skin and bones, they looked like Holocaust survivors. Many of them I cannot show you here, but one I can is of Jackson Brashears from the 65th Indiana Infantry. He was photographed in May 1864, nearly 8 weeks after his release from prison in Richmond. This is a lithograph made from the photographs. It was printed on the front page of Harper's Weekly, June 18, 1864. It was accompanied by an article on the treatment of prisoners in Richmond. One of the worst photos, I cannot show you the whole thing, but I can show you his face. It depicts Philip Haddle of the 51st Pennsylvania Infantry. The photo was taken in 1865. He reported to the Federal Hospital in Annapolis in early June 1865, and he died June 26, 1865. In 1890, the Grand Army of the Republic, Department of Georgia, bought the site of the Andersonville Prison. The site was donated to the federal government by the Women's Relief Corps. Today, Andersonville National Historic Site is run by the National Park Service. And nestled in the heart of the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, stood Libby Prison, a former tobacco warehouse turned military prison, and one of the most infamous prisons of the war. Before the war, Libby Prison was simply an old 3-story tobacco warehouse along the James River in Richmond, located on Tobacco Row. It was later leased by Captain Luther Libby and his son George Libby for their shipping and grocery business. At the start of the American Civil War, the Confederacy needed a facility for a hospital and to house captured Union officers. The warehouse's location was perfect, right on the river and near the railroad. The Confederacy took over the building in late 1861 and began housing prisoners there. Libby Prison had a maximum capacity of 1,000 prisoners. In 1862, the prison would hold strictly Union officers. The first floor held offices. The second and third floors were used to house the prisoners. The basement was split into 3 sections. A storage cellar. In the middle was a carpenter's shop used by civilians, and an abandoned kitchen. The kitchen was once used by Union inmates, but flooding and an infestation of rats caused the Confederates to close it. The abandoned kitchen was known as Rat Hell. The windows had bars but no glass, leaving the prisoners open to the hot, humid summers and cold winter air. A group of Union surgeons who worked in the hospital were released from Libby Prison in 1863 and gave their account to the New York Herald.
Thus, we have over 10% of the whole number of prisoners held classed as sick men who need the most assiduous and skillful attention. Yet, in the essential matter of rations, they are receiving nothing but cornbread and sweet potatoes. Meat is no longer furnished to any class of our prisoners except to the few officers in Libby Hospital, and all sick or well officers or privates are now furnished with a very poor article of cornbread in place of wheat bread, unsuitable diet for hospital patients prostrated with diarrhea, dysentery, and fever, to say nothing of the balance of startling instances of individual suffering and horrid pictures of death from protracted sickness and semi-starvation we have had thrust upon our observation.
The conditions at Libby Prison were horrible. The prisoners faced overcrowding, poor sanitation, lice outbreaks, and food shortages. The Confederates themselves were short on rations. The prisoners were supposed to receive the same rations as Confederate soldiers. The food shortages and high inflation made it difficult to feed the prisoners, let alone the Confederacy's own soldiers. The prisoners had little furniture. Some went without blankets, utensils, clothing, or medical attention. After the prisoner exchanges all but came to a halt in 1863, the prison began to exceed its 1,000-man limit. Disease spread. Dysentery, typhoid pneumonia, and diarrhea were common.
Libby takes in the captured Federals by scores, but lets none out. They are huddled up and jammed into every nook and corner. At the bathing troughs, around the cooking stoves, everywhere there's a wrangling, jostling crowd. At night, the floor of every room they occupy in the building is covered, every square inch of it, by uneasy slumberers lying side by side and heel to head, as tightly packed as if the prison were a huge, improbable box of nocturnal sardines.
After hearing about the conditions at Libby Prison, the U.S. War Department sent food and other provisions to Libby Prison in an attempt to help ensure adequate rations for the Union prisoners. The Confederates controlled and distributed the food. There were reports that a significant amount of the supplies sent by the U.S. were not reaching the Union prisoners. They ended up in the hands of Confederate soldiers. Prisoners suffered from malnutrition and starvation due to the scarcity of food. One of the largest and most successful prison escapes happened at Libby Prison. Major A.G. Hamilton and Colonel Thomas E. Rose led the escape from Libby Prison. Colonel Rose was captured at the Battle of Chickamauga and taken to Libby Prison. He devised a plan to dig a tunnel from the basement of Libby Prison to an old tobacco shed outside of the prison walls. They made it to the basement by removing stone from behind a kitchen stove that was on the first floor, making a passage to the chimney where they would pass down to the basement. The floor of the basement was covered with straw. This was used to cover the entrance of the tunnel and to hide the dirt that was excavated. The men did not have proper digging tools, and they had to deal with the rats constantly, climbing over their bodies. They managed to steal an old spittoon and used that to remove dirt from the tunnel. The conditions in the tunnel were horrible. There was no airflow, making breathing difficult. The tunnel was dug for weeks. After making it almost 60 feet, the men broke through the surface, only to find that their aim had been off. They came up a few feet short from the tobacco shed. They heard guards approaching and quickly hid the opening. They were close. The men changed the direction of the tunnel and aimed again for the tobacco shed. After 17 days, the men succeeded, breaking through the floor of the shed.
Everyone wanted to be first. In order to get down the chimney as well as along the tunnel, it was necessary to strip naked, wrap the clothes in a bundle, and push this on before them. As soon as it was seen that only a few could possibly get out before daylight, all rushed for the mouth of the tunnel who could, each man being determined to get out first. The room was now crowded to suffocation, all struggling to get in the hole. The strongest men forced their way to the front, while the weak ones were more roughly brushed aside and jammed up against the walls.
Once word had reached the other prisoners that a chance for escape had finally come, a mad dash for the tunnel ensued. Over 100 men ran for the tunnel, pushing and shoving to be the first to escape. Once they were assembled in the shed, they simply walked out of the front gate of the warehouse and onto the streets of Richmond. 109 Union prisoners made it down to the first floor, climbed into the wall and down the chimney to the basement, then crawled for nearly 60 feet under the prison walls and up into the shed on the adjoining property. The men separated into small groups and fanned out across Richmond. The remaining prisoners who stayed behind hid the entrance to the tunnel and then returned to their sleeping quarters. At roll call the next morning, the guards were horrified to find 109 men missing. The remaining prisoners were counted multiple times until it was certain that the missing men had escaped. It is unimaginable that the guards did not hear the stampede of men rushing to the first floor and then down the chimney. The night sentinels were even placed under arrest, believing that they had been bribed to let the prisoners escape. But they were eventually released once the tunnels were discovered. It had been nearly 12 hours since the first prisoners had escaped, giving them plenty of time to make their escape. 59 men successfully reached the Union lines. 48 were recaptured, and 2 drowned in the James River trying to escape. There were 3 tunnels dug at Libby Prison in escape attempts. The first tunnel ran into the water and was abandoned. The second hit the building's log foundation, and the third was the story that we just covered. News of Libby Prison's conditions spread. Northern outrage grew. Politicians decried Confederate cruelty. Newspapers published harrowing stories from survivors. The prison became a symbol of Confederate inhumanity. Another escape attempt was tried. This time, a small group of Union cavalry were sent to free prisoners from Libby and Belle Isle, led by Hugh Johnson Kilpatrick and Ehrlich Dahlgren. The raid was stopped by the Confederate Home Guard and Confederate cavalry. Dahlgren was shot 4 times and died on the battlefield. Papers were found on his body that suggested the mission was far larger than an attempt to break out Union prisoners. His orders were reportedly to capture and kill Confederate President Jefferson Davis, his cabinet, and to torch the city. This enraged the public, and a mob dug up his body and put it on display at the railroad depot. His wooden leg was removed and set up in a storefront window. In the spring of 1864, most of the prisoners at Libby were transferred to Georgia. The enlisted men were sent to Andersonville, and the officers were sent to the new prison in Macon. Libby Prison was still being used, mostly as a transfer point for new prisoners, but it continued to house regular prisoners. A few hundred prisoners remained in the fall of 1864. The capture of Richmond and the surrender at Appomattox on April 9, 1865, effectively ended the Civil War. This led to the eventual release of Union prisoners of war. Richmond was occupied, and Libby Prison continued to be used to house Confederate officers. In 1889, Libby Prison was dismantled and rebuilt in Chicago as a war museum. But eventually this venture failed, and in 1899, the prison was dismantled again, but this time it was sold off as scrap. Thousands of Union prisoners walked into Libby Prison, but not all of them walked out. Their letters, memoirs, and stories they left behind ensure that the darkness of that place is never forgotten. An estimated 400,000 prisoners were held at prison camps during the war. Around 56,000 died due to disease, starvation, exposure, and abuse. Camp Douglas was built at the start of the war in 1861. After the firing on Fort Sumter, President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers for 90 days to put down the rebellion. After this failed, more and more volunteers were called for. It was up to the states and local governments to sign up the men, organize and equip them until later on in 1861 when the federal government took over. The buildings in Chicago that were used to house these volunteers had been filled up, so a makeshift camp was set up on the edge of the city. Eventually, this camp would be turned into Camp Douglas. The site was around 60 acres. Senator Stephen Douglas had owned some of the land that was donated to build the camp, and the camp was named after him. But the majority of the land donated was owned by Henry Graves. He had donated around 30 acres, and his home actually bordered on the site. Camp Douglas was established as a Union training facility. It was nearby Chicago, close to the railroad and close to Lake Michigan. These details made it a good location to build the camp, but it proved to be a less than ideal place for a camp. It was built in a low-lying area, so the ground was often wet and flooded. Militia troops were used to build the camp's barracks, but after the barracks were completed, the militiamen claimed that they were not paid what they were promised, and they mutinied. Regular troops had to regain control, and the militiamen were forced to fix the damage that they had caused. The camp would be one of the largest training camps for the Union Army. It housed thousands of men from Illinois and the surrounding states. The main entrance to the camp was on Cottage Grove Avenue. The barracks were wooden and built on the ground initially. They were 24 by 90 feet. They were supposed to house 90 men. The troops' training included daily drills, formations, marching, and weapons training. Many of the soldiers had little to no military experience. They were taught discipline. The men were given daily chores and had inspections often. Many of the men were from rural areas and had never left their small farming communities before. These men were now with thousands of men in tight quarters. Most of them had never been exposed to infectious diseases that were common in urban areas. Disease spread throughout the camp, and some of the men died. Pneumonia, smallpox, measles, malaria, dysentery, typhoid fever. They were all common illnesses in the Civil War camps. Disease would be by far the #1 killer during the Civil War. The men trained here were sent to battlefields in the eastern and western theaters. Between 20 to 40,000 troops went through Camp Douglas and then off to fight across America. Brigadier General Ulysses S. Grant and his Army of the Tennessee captured Fort Donelson in February 1862. This would be the first major Union victory in the Civil War. The Union Army laid siege to Fort Donelson, and after several days of fighting, the Confederate garrison was surrounded. The fort had around 12 to 15,000 men inside. Confederate General Simon Buckner was in charge after his superiors fled the fort. He sent a note to General Grant to discuss terms. Buckner received a response from Grant, which would go down in history. Yours of this date proposing armistice and appointment of commissioners to settle terms of capitulation is just received. No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works. The media will give the name Unconditional Surrender Grant. The men inside Fort Donelson would now become prisoners, and the Federals did not know what to do with them. Around 4,500 of them would be the first to arrive at Camp Douglas. The camp was just that, a camp. It was not a prison. So when the prisoners arrived, they did not know how to house them. About 7,000 men from Camp Donelson would end up at Camp Douglas, from the 12 to 15,000 Confederates captured. When the Confederates arrived, most were poorly dressed. Some even arrived without shoes. The temperatures that day were in the mid-20s. At first, the Confederate prisoners and the Union troops about to leave the camp were housed together. They lived together for a few days until the troops were sent off to fight. A few days later, Confederate officers were transferred, and Camp Douglas was turned into an enlisted POW camp. After the Confederate victory at the Battle of Harper's Ferry in 1862, thousands of Unions had been captured and paroled. But under the terms set by Confederate General Stonewall Jackson, these parolees had to wait in camp until they could be formally exchanged. Thousands of them were sent to Camp Douglas in September of 1862. The men were forced to live in the same conditions as the Confederate prisoners. A year had passed after the camp's construction, and conditions had become bad. Brigadier General Tyler took over command of the camp from Colonel Tucker. Things got so bad that the Union soldiers began rioting and setting fires in the camp. General Tyler quelled the riots with active troops who were able to calm the men. Secretary of War Edward Stanton even ordered General Tyler to go easy on the Union parolees. The prison camps across America early on in the war were meant to hold prisoners for around 10 days, until a prisoner exchange could be negotiated. Enlisted men were traded usually man for man, and a set number of enlisted men were traded for officers. These prisoner exchanges made it so both sides did not have to hold thousands of prisoners. In March of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment was formed. It was the first African American regiment. It was part of the United States Colored Troops. African American troops began fighting the Confederates. But in May of 1863, the Confederate Congress decided that any African American troops captured would be treated as fugitive slaves and returned to their original owners. The Confederate Army would not use any African American soldiers in prisoner exchanges. This backfired and put a halt on all prisoner exchanges. President Abraham Lincoln issued General Orders 252. These orders suspended prisoner exchanges until African American soldiers were treated the same as white soldiers by the Confederates, but they refused. Men on both sides would now be captured in the hundreds and even thousands. The North and the South did not have large prisons to hold tens of thousands of prisoners. Prisoners began to spring up across the North and South, but Camp Douglas had been housing prisoners since 1861. In the fall, the ground turned into a muddy mess. Now thousands of more prisoners would be forced into the camp. Private William Huff wrote a diary about his stay at Camp Douglas. These are a few of his entries. October 4th, 1863, arrived at Camp Douglas. The day was very cold and we were kept standing in the open square for about 4 hours. We had nothing to eat for 2 days. We are guarded by the Michigan sharpshooters, and sharpshooters they are, for they practice often on some of us and shoot in the barracks if the lights are not out punctually at 9 o'clock. November 11th, the barracks occupied by the Yankees caught fire today, and a large portion of them were destroyed. We were all ordered to our quarters. The fire created quite an excitement among both Federals and prisoners. The evening paper contained the following report of the fire. Camp Douglas is on fire and the prisoners escaping. No such luck happened. One of the features of Camp Douglas is the brokers who deal in almost everything. They buy and sell Confederate money, greenbacks, and sutler tickets. And the sutler store is crowded from morning until night. January 1st, 1864. Every Confederate prisoner will remember this day. I'm going to headquarters to report. I had my nose, ears, and chin frozen this morning. Frost was on the rafters and planks on the roof, and some places icicles of 2 inches hung down. This was caused by the breath congealing and freezing to the roof. It was all we could do not only to keep warm, but to keep from freezing. The guards even were frozen on the fence and had to be relieved every half hour. June 1864. It is rather difficult to escape, but now and then some fellow is lucky enough to do so. Several of my old companions have gone to another barrack, and my only way of passing time is with my pencil and guitar. But it is hard to get strings, so I use my pencil more than my music. They have taken our cooking vessels from us, and instituted kitchens, and shortened our rations, giving us nothing but pork and bread, and not quite enough of that. I do not mean fresh pork, oh no, but salt pickled pork, old and fat, and not water enough to wash it down. It is rather tough living, but we have to stand it. I think if the commissioner were here for a week, they would agree on an exchange. Private William Huff. In February of 1863, the temperatures plummeted to as low as 20 below zero. There were almost 4,000 prisoners behind the walls of Camp Douglas this month, men from all over the South. Some men from Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi. They had rarely felt temperatures below freezing in their states. Now they were forced into these thin wooden barracks with little insulation, in frigid weather with little clothing. The death rate was the worst that month. 387 dead out of 3,884 prisoners. Disease was rampant, plus the sewers could not accommodate so many men, so dysentery spread throughout the camp. Many escaped from Camp Douglas. Some were recaptured, others made their way back to Confederate lines, and others just went home. The barracks were raised off of the ground to prevent tunneling. On one occasion, a tunnel was discovered under a barracks. The men were forced to stand in a line, and the guards were ordered to shoot any man that sat down. 3 were shot, and 1 died. The men who dug the tunnel confessed and were sent to the dungeon. The White Oak Dungeon was an underground, small 18-square-foot room with a hatch in the ceiling that led to the guard room as the only entry point, and a small window with bars for light. The space was dark, poorly ventilated, and damp. Prisoners confined there were subjected to minimal rations, sometimes only bread and water. Dozens of men could be forced into the dungeon at a time. It was said that the dungeon had a horrible stench, which escaped through the window and through the guardroom. There were other forms of punishment at the camp. Men were hung by the thumbs. They were forced to stand on a barrel. They had signs hung off of them. Bucking and gagging. The men's hands were tied together in front of them, and then they were bent over with the knees against their chest, while a stick was put between their arms and legs to immobilize them. Men were forced to sit on a wooden horse for long periods of time. These forms of corporal punishment were also inflicted on the Union troops, depending on their crimes or infractions in the field. Over 500 of Morgan's raiders were sent to Camp Douglas after being captured trying to cross into West Virginia from Ohio. They were caught crossing the Ohio River. Morgan's men had many escape attempts while at Camp Douglas. On one occasion, 100 men had escaped into Chicago through the tunnels. Most were recaptured. Many underage prisoners were held at Camp Douglas, some as young as 14, but the Army refused to release them. On New Year's Day, 1864, the same day that Private William Huff described in his diary, some prisoners managed to escape that day, but the temperature was negative 18 degrees and a blizzard had hit. Some of the men froze to death while trying to escape. They were found later on. There was a supposed conspiracy to free the prisoners at Camp Douglas in 1864, but some historians believe that the plot never really happened. The plot was supposedly led by Confederate agents in Canada and some members of the Sons of Liberty. The plan was to have a mass breakout of Camp Douglas with help from Confederate sympathizers in Chicago. Weapons would be given to the prisoners after they had escaped, and a series of attacks would follow across the Midwest. But there is much debate about how far the plan actually went. Colonel Sweet, commander of the camp, believed the plot was real, and arrests were made, but many were released. Colonel Sweet was also known for the use of punishments and ration cutting while in command. He banned candles to try and stop tunneling, and he had the prisoners searched every day for contraband. But he also did a lot to try and improve the camp and have the prisoners kept clean. When word reached Washington about the horrors of Andersonville, D.C. officials ordered rations to be cut for the Confederate prisoners. Camp Douglas was often compared to Andersonville for the deaths and diseases, but there were big differences. The South by this point could barely feed its own people. Mass inflation raised prices to unbelievable numbers. The Anaconda Plan had blocked supplies from reaching the South. The North did not have these problems and could have easily fed the Confederate prisoners. It was in retaliation. That is why the prisoners' rations were cut. At Andersonville, the guards' own rations were cut multiple times, and they were close to starving themselves. There was not really any excuse in the North. Andersonville was much different. Prisoners at Andersonville were put into a 40-acre open field with a stream flowing through the middle, and not much else was there. They were not given shelter. The men used clothes and blankets or whatever they could find to build tents or shelters. At Camp Douglas, there was over 100 buildings. The camp was built originally for Union troops. A month after the surrender of Robert E. Lee at Appomattox Courthouse, most of the prisoners were released from Camp Douglas. First, they were asked to sign the Oath of Allegiance. Around 1,700 refused to sign the allegiance, and they were not given transportation home. A few months later, only the sick remained at the camp. Camp Douglas had seen 20,000 to 40,000 prisoners walk through its gates during the war. Estimates range that between 4,000 to 7,000 died at the camp, and it had a death rate at around 17%. Elmira Prison Camp had a death rate of 24%. It had 12,000 prisoners, and around 3,000 died. Andersonville had a death rate at around 29%. 45,000 prisoners were held at Andersonville, and around 13,000 died. Civil War prison camps were all horrible. Men suffered from diseases, starvation, and torture. It's not talked about nearly enough. The famous glorious battles get the headlines. The sufferings of Americans on both sides needs to be remembered. I want to thank you all for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed, and we will see you on the next. Peace.